So, cards on the table. Sometimes I mourn the loss of the boyhood that I never had. I was raised in an egalitarian family, certainly not one that would have treated me any differently had I been assigned male at birth, but still, I wonder. I wonder what my life would look like if I'd had the security in my identity from day one. If I hadn't spent upwards of 20 years playing a role that was assigned to me rather than the one that I was naturally suited for. I wonder what kind of man I'd be if I'd just been able to be myself rather than hold that person at arm's length to keep up appearances. And I was going through this thought pattern some time back when I came to a strange realization. Feeling trapped in a role that conflicts with my nature, existing in an increasing state of emotional detachment from myself, awareness that sharing my reality could be catastrophic to the image that I had cultivated. The abject fear of no longer being able to control how people perceive me, of having to lay my truth out there and accept their judgment and any pain it might cause, and knowing there's not a damn thing I could do about it. Having the illusion of choice. The decision of whether or not I wanted to remain miserable in secret or tear down the walls I'd built up and expose who I really am to the social elements. Maybe I did experience boyhood after all. Hi squad, welcome/welcome back, and dog, bless you. This one has been a long time coming, and I'm not gonna lie to you, part of that was I just wasn't ready to open myself up to the discussion. About a year ago, I had a conversation with a friend who honestly kind of blew my mind when they pointed out that emotional expression and vulnerability are two different things. Because I've always been comfortable expressing my emotions, but vulnerability is a lot more humbling. To be vulnerable means you have no control. So while it was one thing to express emotion, how willing was I to be really real with people to the point that the outcome was out of my hands entirely? I had my first real run-in with that when I came out as trans, and again, it was rough. Not really what I would call a great time, but worth it? Absolutely. Now, I'm not of the mind that changes always necessitate some level of suffering, but I do think that our struggles are really good opportunities for positive change. Now, I'm going to talk about positive change on a personal level in just a moment, but first I'd like to talk about positive change on a much larger scale by discussing today's sponsor, Ren. I was pumped when Ren reached out because I think the work that they're doing is fantastic, because the climate crisis isn't coming, it's here. In 2019, Bahamas was devastated by Hurricane Dorian. Nearly 3 years later, Bahamians are still rebuilding communities and mourning unimaginable losses. I can't even begin to describe the helplessness I felt watching this play out, waiting for word from my friends and family who were weathering this horrible storm. If you're like me, you've also felt a sense of helplessness in regards to the climate crisis despite making lifestyle changes to live more sustainably. Being one person trying to tackle a problem so massive is a surefire path to task paralysis. But it doesn't have to be, and that's where Ren comes in by being a simple, effective way to take action against the climate crisis. Ren.co is a website that lets you calculate your carbon footprint and then offset it by funding carbon reduction projects like tree planting and rainforest protection. All you do is answer some questions about your lifestyle and then sign up for a monthly contribution to offset your carbon footprint. Once you're signed up, you get monthly updates on the projects you're helping to fund. Not only do you see how your money is being spent, you're seeing real change in the works. One of the many reasons I was excited to work with Ren is that their projects not only center the environment, but the human beings living within it. Just one example is their tech-enabled Amazon rainforest protection, which works with indigenous people of the Amazon to detect and prevent deforestation. My partnership with Ren also means that for the first 100 people who sign up using my referral link, 10 extra trees will be planted. So, let's plant some heckin' trees, because we're all in this together. And whether you're already engaged in climate action or just starting out, Ren is a great way to contribute. So thank you so much to Ren for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. In stressful circumstances, whether they're personal, cultural, or global, many of us have a tendency to grasp at control. Now, this isn't necessarily the pursuit of power over others, though it can tip in that direction. Usually it starts with the need for power and control over ourselves and our circumstances, which makes sense, because vulnerability is an incredibly scary feeling. As I already touched on, I conflated vulnerability and openness for most of my life. I was very much of the mind that being able to be honest about my feelings and work through them was sufficient. That counted as being vulnerable. And I could blather on about how this isn't the case, but I think the easiest thing to do to get to my point here is to just share my story. Granted, I'll be starting with someone else's. About 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Lucila, a professional ballet dancer whose life was completely upended in a horrible accident that nearly killed her. While out rollerblading, she was hit by a van and ended up in a coma for 2 weeks with extensive injuries to her jaw, neck, and brain. It was a long road to recovery for Lucila, and a devastating event that put a hard stop on her career as a ballerina without any certainty of when she could return to dancing, if at all. My initial response to hearing her story was sympathy, not to mention a whole lot of distress on her behalf. But I remember her quelling my outpouring of platitudes she'd no doubt heard 100 times over from everybody who knew her situation by telling me that she was actually glad that it happened. She explained to me that before her accident, she took herself very seriously, both within and outside of her career. That having a near-death experience and having to redevelop her relationship with and control over her body gave her a new appreciation for it. That understanding just how fragile life is meant a newfound levity in the face of things that would have before felt very serious. And she said something that really stuck with me, which was, "I hope everyone gets hit by their van, whatever that looks like." Now, of course, she didn't mean this literally, and I have to stress that, but it really did help me recontextualize some of the pain and difficulty that I was working through in my own life at the time. My metaphorical van was coming out as trans at 28. I lost the life that I saw for myself, the one that was based on the script that I had been given when I was born. And that alone was challenging enough to process, but that really wasn't the worst of it. Because the one thing that I had always been really confident in was my relationship with others, and for the first time in my life, I saw a very real threat being posed to that confidence. I couldn't be sure how the people closest to me would react, and this was the primary thing that kept me silent for the years leading up to my egg finally cracking. I wasn't ready to be that vulnerable. It felt easier to live with the chronic underlying stress of wearing a mask than to put myself through the experience of intense, acute stress of being myself and potentially getting rejected for who that person is. To have people see me for me, but have no control over what they do with that information. And when I finally broke down and put myself out there, it was a mixed bag. Some of my loved ones accepted me wholeheartedly. Some struggled, but eventually came around. Some accepted me, but recognized that there would be an inevitable, permanent change in our dynamic. And some did reject me. Or, at least change their feelings towards me so much that our relationships as we had known them concluded entirely. And you know what? It sucked. It was awful. It hurt in ways that I had never experienced before. But, having lived it, I can't say that I hope to never experience those feelings again. Because, while it took a huge emotional toll on me, I made it through. And as overwhelming and intense as those emotions were, they were nothing in comparison to the relief and freedom that I felt no longer having to live a lie. So I know that if I'm ever in that place again, for all the inevitable pain of vulnerability, I have so much freedom and relief waiting for me on the other side of it. Getting through the hurt and the terrifying nature of vulnerability confirmed that tackling it was worth it. Giving up control is often just giving up the illusion of control and finding a new, more tangible power in acceptance of yourself and your limitations. We can't control how the world receives us, just what we put into it. And accepting that helped me change for the better, both in how I relate to myself and how I relate to others. In my last video in this unofficial series, I briefly mentioned the masculine hero complex around giving help, and I'd like to dig into that a little bit more now, because this is another aspect of toxic masculinity and how boys and men are socialized that I don't think really gets talked about with the full context as often as it should. There is a very masculine behavior pattern of always being the hero, the problem solver, always having to interject insight, even, perhaps especially, when it's not actually being asked for. And generally I see this being framed as main character syndrome. Men, especially white men, assuming a certain level of inherent importance in ourselves and our perspectives just by being the demographic most often represented. We are the most commonly seen configuration of human in both politics and entertainment alike. So, yes, there absolutely is a certain level of social conditioning that tells boys and men we need to be seen and heard just for existing, and that is absolutely a problem. In addition to this though, I wonder how much of the male hero complex goes back to a fear of vulnerability. After all, when you're fed the idea of your identity being one of power, problem solving, and leadership, who even are you if you don't embody those traits? I mentioned this earlier, and I've talked about it on my channel a fair amount before, but there's a lot of comfort and security to be found in social scripts. It gives your life meaning, direction, and a certain amount of predictability to just follow the role assigned to you. That is, it gives you control. Kind of related side note, but it makes a lot of sense that queer men tend to often, not always, but often, break away from traditional manhood stereotypes because we already know what it's like to lose script security and have to start from scratch. Could be part of the reason why so many cisgender heterosexual men find us threatening. But digging a little bit further into the hero complex, I have spent years working to acknowledge and correct the fact that oftentimes when I'm driven to help others, it's from a place of avoidance when it comes to helping myself. That is, it lets me experience a sense of power and efficacy rather than open myself up to vulnerability by turning the problem-solving lens inward. Because you can't really fix problems in yourself if you haven't taken the time to identify them. Finding and fixing problems elsewhere makes you feel strong and effective, but taking time to acknowledge them in yourself makes you feel weak and inadequate. I discussed oppositional sexism and toxic masculinity in the video before this one, but I want to call on that with a reminder that people of all genders are subjected to the patriarchal training that femininity is bad because femininity is weakness, and undoing this training takes work. Now, clearly disentangling being weak and being feminine is a huge part of the solution here, and I want to focus on a specific angle of it, which is the strength inherent in being vulnerable and the power that men have over our lives when we just let ourselves be true to who we are without fear. In this case, the fear of being feminine. So I think the best way for me to crack into this topic is to just go ahead and lay it all out there. When I was an adolescent, I went through a not like other girls phase, and cutting right to the chase, this turned out to be very true because I'm a dude, but at the time operating under the assumption that all cis girls actually wanted to be boys and that was just par for the course, I worked really hard to distance myself from everything remotely feminine. Makeup? Yuck. Dresses? Never. Fruity drinks? Only beer. Feminism? Never would have called myself a feminist despite unknowingly agreeing with all of the principles. Mostly because I never bothered to actually learn what it was all about. I just saw the stamp of woman on it and rejected it as a bad thing on that basis alone. I was one of the guys, and proud of it. In fact, I had convinced myself that friendships with girls just weren't really my thing because, you know, girls were just so dramatic. Never mind the fact that my best friend at the time was a girl and that this developed into my longest running friendship. She's pretty rad. Grew up to be a punk rocker pirate queen who cage dives with great white sharks. You know, just femme things. Getting right to the point, as someone assigned and raised female, girlhood and womanhood felt like an affliction. At best, a compromise. And my security and sense of control relied heavily on removing myself as far from these things as I possibly could while still maintaining the role of cis girl. I was defining myself in opposition to something and rejecting a construct that I believed to be inferior rather than figuring out who I actually was and what that person looked like. Many cis women go through a phase like this as well and have to unpack these feelings as internalized misogyny. But for me, a closeted trans man, I would argue that I was actually performing toxic masculinity, albeit in a very convoluted way. Part of my dysphoria was brought on by the fact that I was living the very thing that so many men are taught to fear the moment they leave the hospital wrapped in their little blue blankets. I was living femininity, and I was perceived as such regardless of how hard I tried to distance myself from it. So I was failing as a man. I can't point to a specific moment in time when I began to confront these biases, but as I began to learn and read more, I started to recognize this misogynistic training that I had internalized, not necessarily by anything specific in my upbringing, but just the world at large. And as I started unpacking this, it occurred to me that I had been played by cultural forces. I couldn't point to a single reason why feminine things were bad just by virtue of being feminine, because get this, there isn't one. In fact, exploring a lot of these stereotypically feminine behaviors indicated a lot of areas where things in my life were missing. It hit me that I had been separated from an entire facet of my personhood, and fostering the separation wasn't doing anything to make me feel happier or more secure in who I was. So I addressed it. I decided to lean into all of the things deemed lesser because of their femininity and see what they were actually about, not just what I had been told about them. What I found was an incredible amount of peace. I liked things just because I liked them, not because of how they fed my carefully cultivated image. I became a much more emotionally balanced human being, which made me a much better friend and also a nicer person to be around in general. And most importantly, in my story, by dismantling my misogyny and embracing womanhood, I realized that it wasn't right for me. Reaching a place where I no longer felt threatened by femininity made me realize that it was never a fear of the feminine that drove me away. It was just the fact that being a woman isn't me. And it took connecting with my femininity to realize this, because at that point, I became a whole person, and I got to see myself for who I really am. Feminine and masculine have become terms that we use to describe feelings and behaviors that all people of all genders experience. And patriarchy has cut us off from the peace and comfort that comes with getting to experience these things honestly. Activist, writer, and educator Tony Porter coined the term the man box, which describes the limited set of behaviors necessary to be considered men. Don't fit in the box, then you're not a real man. And if you're not a real man, then what are you?
I can remember speaking to a 12-year-old boy, a football player, and I asked him, I said, how would you feel if in front of all the players, your coach told you you were playing like a girl? Now, I expected him to say something like, I'll be sad, I'll be mad, I'll be angry, or something like that. No, the boy said to me, it would destroy me. And I said to myself, God, if it would destroy him to be called a girl, what are we then teaching him about girls?
I obviously can't speak to the cis man experience, but I wanted to put my story out there as a man who has lived that apparently horrifying scenario of being a woman. I have met more than a few trans men who are steeped in toxic masculinity for this very reason. Guys who are mired in a sense of inadequacy for being trans, for having lived as women, or have only been exposed to archetypes of manhood that are completely devoid of any positivity. That is, toxic masculinity. They think that's the only way to be a man and actively put effort into achieving that. And I'm not going to shade these guys. I don't think what they're doing is okay, but I do understand where it comes from. I don't want to frame my own experience as embracing my feminine side and then suddenly being fully secure in myself and okay with who I am as a person. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that. I didn't just overcome misogyny. Confronting cultural conditioning is a process that goes on as long as we're engaging with the culture that conditions us. For most of us, that means it's a lifetime thing. The intersection of misogyny and transphobia led me to my transmedicalist arc. Just this shitty cyclone of inferiority complexes, both going back to the fact that I thought being trans and being female were both bad ways to be. But when I asked myself why that's the case, I couldn't come up with an answer beyond that's just what I've been told. I made a decision to not only reconcile with my trans identity, but celebrate it and the unique insight that it gives me. I am glad that I was assigned female at birth. I am glad that for all my struggles as a trans person, I can cuddle my friends, I can tell people that I love them, and I can cry when I need to. I am glad that I get to present my whole self to the world and know that it sets the stage for other people to meet me with the same honesty. That is what real strength feels like. No longer frantically clinging to the illusion of control that we exact over our images and instead just letting go and letting people see us. And it is scary. Because in addition to all of the image building that boys are trained to do, they are also taught to be the gatekeepers of manhood and to punish anyone who breaks out of the man box. But so many of them miss the power in realizing that they get to decide what masculinity is and what manhood should look like. Because there's really nothing more rebellious than casting aside the expectations set on us at birth. And there's nothing quite as bold as being unapologetically soft. And you'd be hard-pressed to find something as empowering as vulnerability, because it lets us find out who we really are, which gives us a much better shot at becoming who we want to be. Femininity is not scary because it's weakness. It's scary because expressing it and exploring it makes us vulnerable. Many of us aren't ready to see the whole picture that will come to light, or take on the judgments from other people for taking those steps. And it's not on me to push other people to do that before they're ready. I just wanted to offer my story in the hopes that it might help others. Because living as a woman made me a better man. And I can't help but wonder how much this fear of femininity is just outright misogyny, and how much of it is about maintaining that illusion of control. Either way, having an identity based on fear and opposition, not a great way to live your life, and I can attest to that. I've alluded to it before, but I have struggled with a certain amount of imposter syndrome when it comes to talking about masculinity and issues that impact men. Some of this does go back to a certain level of defensiveness from cis men, but a lot of it is self-imposed. It went back to the fact that I simply didn't feel man enough, and to what degree this was internalized transphobia, and to what degree this is the fairly common male experience of just not being enough, I don't really know. But I do know that both factors contributed. And I also know that my efforts to run from them got me a whole lot of nowhere. I didn't find the feeling of being enough by hiding in fear, because how could I? Once again, we can't fix problems that we don't acknowledge. I think a lot of boys and men are led away from introspection by male authority figures that they're told to look up to, or dudes they idolize for their hard leaning on the masculine archetypes of leaders who tell it like it is and don't care who they hurt in doing so. And I think that's really sad. Not to mention ironic, given that many of these guys achieve their power and influence by having a fan base that doesn't question them. It's a formula of, you're all alphas, now do exactly what I say. I think it's important to honestly ask ourselves if mindlessly following some of these thought leaders gives us perspective on anything other than their coattails. And I think it starts by stepping back and examining why we do the things that we do. Where is that coming from? And what is it achieving? Why are we so afraid of kindness, of being sensitive, of appearing feminine? Can we really claim to be strong if we're threatened by gentleness itself? Why would we rather huff the toxic fumes of old guys who prey on our insecurities than set our own standard of what it is to be a man? Regardless of your feelings here, I think it's worthwhile to consider alternative framings of manhood. Because if you do experience these insecurities in isolation, this could help start repairing your relationship with yourself and those around you. And if you're firmly set in your ways and feel that there's no room for consideration or negotiation here, that's a little bit odd to me. After all, security in our own identities means that we're not threatened by other people differing in theirs. I'd like to recommend some resources to aid in this consideration, all of which can be found down in the description section. I already mentioned Tony Porter, who you can learn more about at acalltomen.org. In addition, I'd like to recommend the Man Enough podcast with Justin Baldoni, Liz Plank, and Jamie Heath. Baldoni's TED Talk is another one to check out. It's one of my absolute favorites.
As a boy, all I wanted was to be accepted and liked by the other boys. But that acceptance meant I had to acquire this almost disgusted view of the feminine. And since we were told that feminine is the opposite of masculine, I either had to reject embodying any of these qualities or face rejection myself. This is the script that we've been given. Right? Girls are weak and boys are strong. This is what's being subconsciously communicated to hundreds of millions of young boys and girls all over the world. Just like it was with me. Well, I came here today to say, as a man, that this is wrong, this is toxic, and it has to end.
Mark Green, the author of Remaking Manhood, has a wonderful podcast of the same name, co-hosted by Charles Matthews, that focuses on positive masculinity and deconstructing man-box culture. I've also included 3 additional talks by Mazen Jamal, Ben Hurst, and Michael Kimmel, all of which I could just watch over and over again. They're so good. There's no shortage of resources in this endeavor to begin rebuilding manhood, but the cultural forces inhibiting us from connecting with and accessing them are incredibly real. So let's start a rebellion, because the world will be a brighter place for people of all genders if we do. I've accepted that I can't change what my younger self went through, but I can be the person that he needed to see. And I can be part of a change that will spare other kids the pain that I went through. And this goal is worth any vulnerability that I might have to take on to get there. There are so many things that I wanted to include in this video, but it would have been way too long if I did. There are obviously a lot of things not captured in my experience, and I prefer to just kind of stay in my lane. Since we're talking about vulnerability, I am often afraid to put these videos out there because there is simply no way that I can tackle all angles in a way that would be satisfying to every single person who might come across this content. This is both because I am simply one person and also because I just don't think it's okay for me to speak on certain things. But I did spend a whole lot of time thinking about how all of the stuff I've talked about here must impact trans feminine people. How being put in the man box by other people when you're literally not even a man must feel. How the fear of femininity could run a lot deeper for its truth, or be a comfort turned to in secret. There's also only so much that I can speak to on the topic of masculinity as a white dude. Men and transmasculine people of color will have a whole lot more that they can bring to this conversation and have brought to this conversation. So 2 of the follow-up chapters to this series are going to be just that. Please reach out if you're interested in either contributing your story or having me help signal boost whatever platform you use to talk about it. I know I don't have that much of a following here, but I'd really like to help in any way that I can. Ideally, I would love to feature clips of people speaking in their own words, but if you would rather, just contribute anonymously or be credited and have me or somebody else read your contribution, that would also be great. I'd be happy to do that as well. My contact info for this project can be found down in the description section, so I really hope to hear from some of you soon. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to thank Lucila for letting me share her story as part of this video, and for the positive impact that it had on me. I have linked both her channel and her memoir if you would like to show her some support and learn more about her experience. I have it on good authority that things are coming to her YouTube channel, so stay tuned. If you made it to the end of this video, I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you've come away from it with something positive, or that you're maybe motivated to share your own story. You all know I love reading your comments. Even if I don't always have time to reply, I always have time to listen. I have barely scratched the surface here, but let's call it for now, and I will see you next time. And as always, thanks for watching.